Welcome back to a year of Final Fantasy, and we're still in the month of Odin, and today we're going to be talking about the game that I've been excited to talk about for quite some time, and that is Final Fantasy Dissidia, or Dissidia Final Fantasy, as you'll see it more properly called. We're going to be talking about both the original game and Duodecim, and that's because the original game is actually incorporated completely in its expansion. I don't really want to call it a sequel, but I guess some people will, and that is Duodecim, like I mentioned before. So what is Dissidia Final Fantasy? Well, it's a spin-off game that's released exclusively for the PlayStation Portable, and its sequel expansion Duodecim was also released on the PSP a little later down the line. This game itself is the first Final Fantasy fighting game proper, and let me clarify myself before you're gonna go in the comments and type. There was another fighting game a very long time ago that Square made on the PlayStation 1 called Guys, and that did feature a few Final Fantasy VII characters in it. That's really just cameos that the Final Fantasy VII characters made in that fighting game that they created. That was a completely different thing. And I want to also clarify that this is a 3D fighting game, which we'll go into a little bit more of depth and explanation here in a bit. But let's talk about some release data first, and then we'll dive right into what this game really has to offer. So the original Dissidia released on PSP in Japan on December 18th, 2008, and about a year later on August 25th, 2009. Now, originally the game had 22 characters. 20 of them were just kind of there for you to get, and there were 2 more that you could unlock. So the 20 that we had were originally 1 hero and 1 villain all the way up until Final Fantasy X. Apart from that, the additional 2 secret characters, one of which was a hero from Final Fantasy XI, and one of them was a villain from Final Fantasy XII. Really quick, we're going to go over them. So I'm going to do these in pairs, Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, etc. First, we have the Warrior of Light. Just in general, it's not a specific class, it's just the Warrior of Light and Garland. Final Fantasy 2, we have Furion and the Emperor. Final Fantasy 3, we have Onion Knight and Cloud of Darkness. Final Fantasy 4, we have Cecil and Golbez. Final Fantasy 5, we have Bartz and Exdeath. Final Fantasy 6, we have Terra and Kefka. 7, we have Cloud and Sephiroth. 8, we have Squall and Ultimecia. 9, we have Zidane and Kuja. And finally, in 10, we have Titus and Jecht. Now, they finish off the basic list like I talked about. Those are your 20 main characters, and the additional 2 were Shantoto from Final Fantasy XI and the Judge Gabranth from Final Fantasy XII. That's a lot to get through. But in Duodecim, we actually get some follow-up with some new added characters. Now, they just kind of added some fan favorites as far as I can tell. There's no real rhyme or reason on which game they picked and why. So the new ones added in Duodecim are Kain from Final Fantasy IV, one of my favorites. Gilgamesh from Final Fantasy V. We've talked about Gilgamesh before. He's a huge character in the series. It's clear why they added him. Tifa from Final Fantasy VII. We have Laguna from Final Fantasy VIII, Yuna from Final Fantasy X, Krish from Final Fantasy XI, and Vaughn from Final Fantasy XII, and of course the most recently released game whenever Final Fantasy Dissidia came out, Duodecim, was Final Fantasy XIII, and we have the one and only Lightning, and I'm sorry all of you Lightning haters out there, I absolutely adore that character, so I'm very glad she was added. Now, I don't like what they've done with her, but I'll get into that whenever we get in the Final Fantasy XIII game. Anyway, one last addition to this Duodecim was the boss Feral Chaos, which was a creation from Final Fantasy Dissidia itself, so it didn't really come from any game. It's a completely new and original character. Apart from this massive list of characters, they also have quite a few different arenas modeled after memorable areas from each of the series, and those arenas feature destructible environments and these light rails to zoom around the map on. They're all a joy to play and to see, and of course we have the fantastically remixed music from Nobuo Uematsu from all of the games. It's just such a mind trip nostalgia factor that they're playing on here, and I love it. You know, if you're gonna get a game like this that brings all the characters in, all the stages, all the stuff that we know and love, you know, they did it very, very well here. So let's get to the gameplay itself, and it's incredibly different from your average fighting game, either 2D or 3D fighting game. Also, unlike those traditional fighting games, save for maybe the Dragon Ball franchise, and you'll see why here in a second, your characters are going to be zooming around the battlefield in a very anime fashion, and again, that's why I excluded Dragon Ball, because the fights basically play out much like a typical Dragon Ball Z kind of brawl, where you're just zooming around everywhere and just, it's insane. I can only imagine that they wanted to make the gameplay the way that fights played out in Final Fantasy VII Advent Children. So your fights are not a traditional turn-based thing, obviously. They're just completely over the top in the most glorious, enjoyable ways possible. So the fighting mechanic itself is actually quite simple, but it does get pretty deep later on. I'm just going to talk about the basic mechanics here. There's a bunch of other stuff I'll just briefly mention later. The premise is you have this meter called your Brave meter, and it's representative of your power. And there are two basic attacks in the game. It's a Brave attack and an HP attack. And you gain Brave by attacking with your Brave attack. However, if you get hit, you lose your Brave. So you trade blows back and forth with your opponent and you lose and gain Brave. And whenever you see an opening, you can decide to use an HP attack. Now that's the one that actually wins you the fight. If the HP attack hits and deals damage, it's going to deal damage to your HP. However, it's also going to reduce your Brave that you've accumulated up down to 0, which then you must recover it. And in situations where you, let's say, miss your HP attack and it still reduces it all the way down, if you get hit with a Brave attack, it's going to send you into negative, in which case they call it breaking, you're broken, and you can't really do anything but run away and wait for that Brave to fill up, and then you can start building that up and hitting HP attacks. Now, that's basically it. You do have a bunch of different types of attacks that do different ranges and stuff like that, but it's basically your Brave, and then you build that up, then you hit with your HP attack. So like I said, there's a ton of different things that really make this a very in-depth game. I'll just briefly mention them. Hopefully if something, catches your ear, you may want to play it more. There are things that you can do called assist attacks, and it actually brings in other characters from different games. So you can't play these characters, but they'll help you in some way, shape, or form. Also, you have these things called X-Bursts. If you're familiar with the Final Fantasy trading card game, that's kind of where that came from. Trading card game taking it from this game. You also have summons there, which are kind of like assist attacks. In fact, they may be assist attacks. And there's all kinds of different things. Each character has their own different special way of fighting. For instance, Lightning can do all those transformations that you do in the battles in Final Fantasy 13 games. Nobody else has that, and everyone kind of has their own special thing related to their own special game they're from. So there's just a ton of different ways that this game controls. And more generally, there's actually two different gameplay modes in the game itself. One of them is a more real-time approach where you're going to actually be controlling your characters on a generally one-to-one basis where you're going to move and fight like your traditional fighting games. However, there's another RPG-ish kind of approach where you can have a list and you can press like X to do an attack. So it's more of a Final Fantasy proper feeling like that. And it really just tries to cater to all types of fans. Now, as for the story, it's a fighting game. You're not going to get like some crazy deep story, but for what they have, I guess it's good enough. And really, the sole purpose here is to bring all the characters, celebrate the franchise. And the basic premise here is that the incarnation of chaos that we know from Final Fantasy I has brought all the villains together from all of the universes to control this kind of alternate world B of the original Final Fantasy. It's kind of like a mirror alternate universe. And as Chaos sends forth his villains, Cosmos recruits the heroes from all the different worlds and sends them out to defend the world. I'm not going to go into the story, obviously I don't do that very much here, but it's serviceable for what it is, and it will actually provide you, quite a few hours of story content. So, of course, there's a lot more, but like I said, I don't do the full story analysis stuff in here. Anyway, there's an incredibly large replay value here. You level up your characters, you can obtain items, and all the things that you would expect from a traditional RPG Final Fantasy game. Also, don't fret, you can play a exclusive arcade mode, which actually forgoes all of those items and turns it into a traditional kind of versus brawling game, so nobody is overpowered compared to one or another. So Final Fantasy Dissidia was a hit upon release, and its follower Duodecim really expanded upon the game in some major ways that we've already covered. First thing that's going to jump out of you though is that there's an addition of a world mapped Duodecim to wander around on, rather than just being ushered from these grid-like areas to explore and then go into fights. So it does add a little bit to the original game as far as that goes. I'm not going to say it's like the most mind-shattering thing ever, but it's really cool to see. Second, of course, we have the additional characters that I talked about earlier. Duodecim itself has its own story elements and storylines, being sort of a prequel to the original game, really focusing on Lightning's story. But of course, like I said, Duodecim is fantastic because it includes the entirety of the original game's story. Really, there's absolutely no reason to pick the original game over Duodecim. So a little bit about the development before we end this off. Dissidia started off as a Kingdom Hearts side project with developer Nomura imagining it as an all-out brawl between the Disney characters of the Kingdom Hearts franchise, but it seems Disney didn't really want to be on board with that idea, so they didn't get to go ahead with Disney, and they basically just turned it into the Final Fantasy brawl that we see now. So since Disney didn't want to go forward with the idea, it was turned into a game with Final Fantasy characters, and it turned out to be really, really popular. You might initially equate this with the incredibly popular series of Super Smash Bros., but don't let it delude you. This is not Smash Bros. At all. Even though it has all the characters coming in and fighting, this game plays nothing like Smash Brothers, and I cannot stress that enough. This is Square's own thing. It's not copying anything else. It really doesn't play like anything you've ever seen before. So if this game sounds like something you'd like to pick up, you can go ahead and get it on a PSP if you have it, a Vita if you have it, PlayStation TV, which is my personal choice. The game looks great for a PlayStation Portable game and can provide hours of entertainment. Now, I can't end this without at least acknowledging the future of the series. Recently released only in Japan was a mobile free-to-play game of Dissidia Opera Omnia, so they still haven't officially announced any kind of English version Western release. I'm still hoping for that. There do exist other alternate ways of playing an English game, and I'll just leave it at that. However, I'm going to wait and I'll do a separate video for that later on, still hoping if they come out with an official English release, but as we get farther and farther into this, if they don't, then I'll just go ahead and do a video. Finally, the grand announcement from just very recently, as of this recording, from E3 2017. Actually, it was a little bit before that. They did announce that Final Fantasy Dissidia NT is coming out to the US on PlayStation 4 consoles early in 2018. So after I get my hands on it, I can do it justice with a proper year Final Fantasy video. I don't want to jump the gun and do it over the Japanese arcade stuff. So you're going to have to wait a little while for that. And by a little while, I mean about half a year. But it will definitely come, believe me. Thank you all. And this is actually a very important video because as of this recording, we're celebrating our 1 year anniversary of the Crystarium Network. So I appreciate all of you that's helped out and shared my videos around. I cannot thank you enough for that. But as always, until next time, Crystal Warriors, keep on gaming.